5 on Finniston Farm, Chapter 19, the most exciting adventure we've ever had. After all the excitement of the afternoon, the children felt lazy. The twins went off to feed the chickens. Better late than never, they said together. Where are Mr. Henning and Mr. Durlston and that awful junior, Mrs. Philpot? Asked George, getting up to help with the washing of the tea things. Oh, Mr. Henning came in to say he and Mr. Durlston were going to a meal at a hotel and taking Junior too, said Mrs. Philpot. He seemed very pleased with himself indeed. He said that they had broken through to the cellars of the old castle and expected great things, and that maybe a second cheque of £250 would be coming soon. You won't take it though, will you, Mrs. Philpot? Said Julian quickly, overhearing what was being said. The things down in that cellar will be worth much more than any money Mr. Henning is likely to offer you. He'd only take them to America and sell them for vast sums and make a huge profit. Why should you let him do that? That nice old man, Mr. Finniston, down in the little antique shop, would know what everything was worth, said George. And he's a descendant of the long-ago Finnistons of Finniston Castle, isn't he? He'll be thrilled to bits when he hears what's been happening. We'll send word for him to come up tomorrow, decided Mrs. Philpot. After all, Mr. Henning has his adviser, that surly Mr. Durlston. We'll have Mr. Finniston for ours. Great Grandad would be pleased about that. They're great friends, those two. There was, however, no need to send for Mr. Finniston, for Great Grandad had himself gone down straight away to tell the great news to his old crony. What a talk they had together! Gold coins, jewellery, suits of armour, swords, and goodness knows what else, said Great Grandad for the 20th time, and old Mr. Finniston listened gravely, nodding his head. That splendid big sword, went on Grandad, remembering. Just right for me, William. Look, if I've ever lived before, that old sword once belonged to me. I feel it. That's one thing I won't sell, mind. I'll keep it just for the sake of swinging it round my head when I lose my temper. Yes, but I hope you'll be sure to stand in the middle of an empty room if you do that, said Mr. Finniston, a little alarmed at the fierce look in the old man's eye. You won't be allowed to keep all the money, I'm afraid. There's such a thing as treasure trove, you know. Some finds go to the Crown, and I fear that will be one of them. But the jewellery's different, and the suits of armour, and the swords. You'll be able to make a mint of money on those. Enough for 2 new tractors, said Great Grandad. Enough for a new Land Rover? That one my grandson has. It jolts every bone in my body. Look now, William, we've got to get men digging on that site, uncovering all those cellars. What say we keep on the men that fellow Henning's got? We shan't let him excavate, or whatever it's called any more. Ha! That fellow gets under my skin and sets me itching all over. Now I can scratch him out. And see here, William, you'll shut up this shop of yours and be my adviser, won't you? I won't have that American talking me down, or that fellow Durlston. You'd better stop talking for a bit, Grandad. You're getting too red in the face, said Mr. Finniston. You'll go pop if you excite yourself much more. Go home now, and I'll be up tomorrow morning. I'll arrange about the workmen too, and don't you play about with that old sword too much. You might cut off somebody's head by mistake. So I might, said Great Grandad, with a sly look in his eye. Now, if that junior got in the way when I was swinging my sword, it's all right, William, it's all right. Just my joke, you know, just my joke. And chuckling deep down in his long beard, Great Grandad strode off, turned up the little lane, and walked back to the farmhouse, feeling very pleased indeed with life. Mr. Henning, Mr. Durlston, and Junior did not come back that night. Apparently they were all so excited over the excavations they had made in the drilling down through the cellar roof that they stayed too long at the hotel and decided to spend the night there, much to Mrs. Philpot's relief. Most farm people like to go to bed about 9 o'clock, said Mr. Henning, and it's already gone that now. We'll go over tomorrow morning and we'll get them to sign that agreement you've drawn up, Durlston. They're so short of money they'd sign anything. And mind you cry down what we think we found so that they won't expect any more than £250. We're going to make our fortunes over this. So next morning the two men, with an excited Junior whom Mr. Durlston found most annoying, arrived at the farmhouse at about 10 o'clock. They had telephoned to say they would be there then and would bring the agreement with them. And the cheque, Mrs. Philpot, and the cheque, purred Mr. Henning down the phone. When they arrived, there was quite a company there to greet them. There was old Great Grandad, his grandson, Mr. Philpot, and his wife, the twins, of course, and old Mr. Finniston, sniffing a fight, his dull eyes bright this morning for the first time in years. He sat at the back, wondering what was going to happen. All the five were there too, Timmy wondering what the excitement was. He kept as close to George as he could and growled at Snippet every time the excited little poodle came near. Snippet didn't mind. He could always growl back. A car purred up the drive, and in came Mr. Henning, Mr. Durlston, and Junior, whose face was one big grin. "Hello, folks," said Junior in his usual jaunty manner. "How's tricks?" Nobody answered except Timmy, and he gave a small growl which made Junior skip out of the way quickly. "You shut up," he said to Timmy. "Did you have your breakfast in bed at the hotel, little boy?" suddenly said George. "Do you remember the last time you had it in bed here?" And Timmy pulled. "Ah, shucks," said Junior sulkily. "Skip it, sister." He subsided after that and sat down by his father. Then began a short, sharp, and satisfactory meeting from Mr. Philpot's point of view. Mr. Philpot, it's my very great pleasure to say that I have been advised by Mr. Durlston to offer you a further cheque for £250, said Mr. Henning smoothly. While we are rather disappointed in what appears to be in the cellars of the castle, we feel it would only be fair to offer you the sum we suggested before. Is that right, Mr. Durlston? Absolutely, said Mr. Durlston in a businesslike voice, and glared round through his horn-rimmed glasses. I've the agreement here. Mr. Henning is being very generous, very. The cellars are most disappointing. I'm sorry about that, said Mr. Philpot. I hold a different opinion, and my adviser, Mr. Finniston, upholds me in this. We are going to excavate the site ourselves, Mr. Henning, and then, if any disappointment lies in wait, we shall be the ones to suffer, not you. What's all this? Said Mr. Henning, glaring round. Durlston, what do you say to that? Bit of double-crossing, isn't it? Offer him £500, said Mr. Durlston, looking startled at this unexpected setback. You can offer me 5,000 if you like, but I tell you I prefer to do the excavation myself on my own land, said Mr. Philpot. What is more, I will return you the cheque you gave me yesterday, and as I intend to keep on the men you engaged, I will pay them myself for their work, so do not trouble to dismiss them. They will now be working for me. But this is monstrous, shouted Mr. Henning, losing his temper and jumping to his feet. He banged on the table and glared at Mr. and Mrs. Philpot. What do you expect to find in those derelict old cellars? We drilled right through yesterday, and there's practically nothing there. I made you a very generous offer. I'll raise it to £1,000. No, said Mr. Philpot quietly, but Great Grandad had had enough of Mr. Henning's shouting and raging. He stood up too, and bellowed so loudly that everyone jumped, and Timmy began to bark. Snippet at once fled to the kitchen cupboard and hid there. Ha! Now you listen to me, bellowed Great Grandad. This farm belongs to me and my grandson, and it'll go to my great-grandson sitting yonder. A finer farm there never was, and my family's had it for hundreds of years, and sad it's been for me to see it go downhill for lack of money. But now I see money, much money down in those cellars. Ha! All the money we want for tractors and binders and combines and the Lord knows what. We don't want your money. No, sir. You keep your dollars. You keep them. Offer me 5,000 if you like, and see what I'll say. Mr. Henning turned swiftly and looked at Mr. Dalston, who at once nodded. Right, said the American to Great Grandad. 5,000. Done? No, bawled Great Grandad, enjoying himself more than he had done in years. There's gold down in those cellars, jewels, suits of armour, swords, daggers, knives, all of them centuries old, and don't hand me stories like that, said Mr. Henning sneeringly. You old fibber. Great Grandad banged his clenched fist down on the table and made everyone almost fall off their chairs. Twins, he roared, fetch those things you got yesterday. Go on, fetch them here. I'll show this American I'm no fibber. And then, before the astounded eyes of Mr. Henning and Mr. Dalston, and of Junior too, the twins laid the gold coins, the jewellery, and the swords and knives on the table. Mr. Dalston stared as if he couldn't believe his eyes. Well, what do you say to that? Demanded Great Grandad, banging on the table again. Mr. Dalston sat back and said one word, junk. Then it was old Mr. Finniston's turn to stand up and say a few words. Mr. Dalston, who hadn't noticed the quiet old man sitting at the back, was horrified to see him there. He knew he was learned and knowledgeable, for he himself had tried to pick his brains about the old castle site. Ladies and gentlemen, said Mr. Finniston, just as if he were addressing a well-conducted meeting, I regret to say that, speaking as a well-known antiquarian, I do not consider that Mr. Dalston knows what he is talking about if he calls these articles junk. The things on the table are worth a small fortune to any genuine collector. I could myself sell them in London tomorrow for far more than any sum Mr. Dalston has advised Mr. Henning to offer. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And he sat down, bowing courteously to the assembled company. Anne felt as if she wanted to clap him. Well, I don't think there's anything more to say, said Mr. Philpot, getting up. If you'll tell me what hotel you'll be staying at, Mr. Henning, I'll have your things sent there. You will certainly not wish to stay here any longer. Pop, I don't want to go. I want to stay here, howled Junior most surprisingly. I want to see the cellars exculpated. I want to dig down. I want to stay. Well, we don't want you, said Harry fiercely. You and your peeping and prying and listening and boasting and tale-bearing, sissy boy, breakfast in bed, can't clean his shoes, howls when he can't get his own way, screams when... That's enough, Harry, said his mother sternly, looking quite shocked. I don't mind Junior staying on if he'll behave himself. It's not his fault that all this has happened. I want to stay, wept Junior, and kicked out peevishly under the table. He unfortunately caught Timmy on the nose, and the dog rose in anger, growling and showing his teeth. Junior fled for his life. "Do you want to stay now?" shouted George as he went, and the answer came back at once, "No." "Well, thanks, Timmy, for helping him to make up his mind," said George, and patted the big dog. Mr. Henning looked as if he were about to burst. "If that dog bites my boy, I'll have him put to sleep," he said. "I'll sue you out." "Please go," said Mrs. Philpot, suddenly looking tired out. "I have a lot of baking to do." "I shall take my time," said Mr. Henning pompously. "I will not be turned out suddenly as if I hadn't paid my bills." "Seen the sword, Henning?" said old Great Grandad suddenly, and snatched from the table the big sword that he so much liked. "Beauty, isn't it? The men of old knew how to deal with their enemies, didn't they?" "Here, stop! You're dangerous! That sword nearly cut me!" cried Henning in a sudden panic. "Will you put it down?" "No, it's mine. I'm not selling this," said Great Grandad, swinging the sword again. It hit the light bulb above his head, and the glass fell with a clatter. Mr. Dilston deserted Mr. Henning and fled out of the kitchen at top speed, colliding violently with Bill, who was just coming in. "Look out! He's mad! That old man's mad!" shouted Mr. Dilston. "Henning, come along before he cuts off your head." Mr. Henning fled too. Great Grandad pursued him to the door, breathing blood and thunder, and the two dogs barked in delight. Everyone began to laugh helplessly. "Grandad, what's got into you?" said Mr. Philpot as the old fellow swung the sword again, his eyes bright, a broad grin on his wrinkled old face. "Nothing. I just thought that only this sword would get rid of those fellows. Do you know what I call them? Junk. I wish I'd thought of that when they were here. Junk. William Finniston, did you hear that?" "Now you put that sword down before you damage it," said Mr. Finniston, who knew how to manage Great Grandad. "And you and I will go down to the old inn and talk over what we're going to do about all this treasure trove. You just put that sword down first." "No, Grandad, I am not going to take you into the inn carrying that sword." Mrs. Philpot heaved a sigh of relief when the two old fellows went off down the lane, leaving the sword safely behind. She sat down until the children's horror began to cry. Now, don't take any notice of me," she said when the twins ran to her in dismay. "I'm crying for joy to have got rid of them, and to know I've not got to pinch and scrape any more, or to take in visitors. To think that your dad can buy the farm machinery he wants, and oh dear, what a baby I am, acting like this." "I say, Mrs. Philpot, would you like us to leave too?" asked Anne, suddenly realizing that she and the others were ranked as visitors, and must have been an added burden for poor Mrs. Philpot. "Oh no, my dear, no. You're not really visitors. You're friends," said Mrs. Philpot, smiling through her tears. "And what's more, I shan't charge your mothers a single penny for having you here. See what good fortune you've brought us." "All right, we'll stay. We'd love to," said Anne. "We wouldn't miss seeing what else is down in those castle cellars for anything, would we, George?" "Gosh, no," said George. "We want to be in on everything. This is just about the most exciting adventure we've ever had." "We always say that," said Anne, "but the nice part about this one is it isn't finished yet. We'll be able to go and watch the workmen and their drills. We'll be able to help in moving all the exciting old things out of their hiding places. We'll hear what prices you get for them and see the new tractor. Honestly, I really do believe the second part of this adventure will be better than the first. Don't you think so, Timmy?" "Woof," said Timmy, and wagged his tail so hard that he knocked Snippet right over. "Well, goodbye, Five. Enjoy the rest of your adventures, and have a good time, and do make sure that Grandad is careful with that great old sword.